So we will try to formulate something that is useful.
Sure.
And then maybe even entertaining for somebody else. There's probably going to be like 6 people that are going to be interested in this call. Or it's going to be like really cool. You know what I mean? It's going to like fall into one of those extremes. Good morning. Happy Wednesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. Okay. It is Wednesday. That means that tomorrow is Thursday. And as usual, at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll be doing the Coffee and Coaches Conference call. I think we're into a year on these, and they just evolved into something that's totally fun. We got a great group of people. We got a bunch of regulars that come in. We get new people every week, so please join us for that. The Q&As are getting a lot of attention, so I get a lot of good feedback on these. And so we're just going to keep doing those. And so if you'd like to participate in a Q&A with me on video that we post up here on the social media, then go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com. Put 15-minute consult in the subject line so I do not delete it. Speaking of which, got a regular from the Coffee and Coaches Conference call in the Q&A this morning. It's from Paul, and Paul is very well read. He's a very deep thinker. He sent me a really long email with a whole bunch of questions, but where it led us was to a discussion of some of the foundational principles of the model, like how did this actually come to be, and where did some of these things come from. And so we discussed that, and it was the last call of the day. So I just let it go because we were having such a good time going back and forth, and so I think the call went 35 minutes. I'll end up posting the whole thing up on the YouTubes. So if you're digging this call, then go there, subscribe, and watch the entire call, because again, we just had a great time. Paul's a good dude, and I will see him obviously tomorrow, Thursday morning. A Coffee and Coaches Conference call. Please enjoy this Q&A as we always do, and then I will see you guys tomorrow for coffee, and then we will continue this process as we go through the week. So everybody have a great day. I will see you. We are on. Okay, so I was a little worried about this one, Paul. It might be above my pay grade.
It's above mine too, man. I need somebody to talk to about it. I
understand. And believe me, I'm interested. I just don't know. I don't know to what degree I can satisfy your desires here, because even some of the people that are totally invested in some of this stuff have no answers. So we will try to formulate something that is useful.
Sure.
And then maybe even entertaining for somebody else. There's probably going to be like 6 people that are going to be interested in this call, or it's going to be like really cool. You know what I mean? It's going to like fall into one of those extremes, whereas like a lot of people are going to go, wow, or there's going to be like 60. So, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, they'll get a couple minutes.
All right, so fire away. You start.
Okay. I know I wrote you multiple paragraphs.
Yeah. It was a good book.
For the sake of the recording, do you want me to recap some of that, or do you just want to?
It's up to you. This is your call. So if you feel like again, you could just formulate a question, or you could give the background. It doesn't matter to me.
Cool.
So whatever you need to express.
Okay. For the sake of time, how about I touch on some of the examples I listed in the paragraph.
Yep.
As far as the main question, when I just look at your model and I continue to sit with it and think about it, and try to make sense of it, because it is so different from all the stuff I've learned about anatomy and biomechanics and all that stuff. It's very different. But even though it's challenging my mind, it also is resonating with a lot of other things that I've learned about the fundamental nature of nature. So, it's very ambiguous. Gradients is really what we're dealing with here. Things like entanglement, quantum entanglement, that all deals with this concept of, or exists on this idea that everything's connected. And when you talk about gradients in like a joint space, ER and IR occurring simultaneously, but with varying degrees, that just sounds a lot like some of the stuff I hear particle physicists describing when they're talking about how things actually work. And it seems like your model describes how things actually work a bit better, even though it's strange. It seems to be in line with the strange stuff that seems to explain the nature of the universe the best. So that's where I'm like, I'm simultaneously confused, but also recognizing that I'm on the right track when looking at your material. So my main question is, how did you come upon such a cohesive model? Did you actually try to make it fit in with the governing ideas, or was it just by chance? Like, as you, like, for example, the rib cage, when you look at the helical structure or helical angles of a rib cage, I've never heard anybody say something like that. And when you talk about how we can, the principles that govern the structure of a tetrahedron and, you know, helical angles on the micro scale, those same principles can apply to the macro scale when we're talking about our rib cage. So that's also just shows me that you're on to something that's a little bit closer than what a lot of other people have been talking about, because you're considering all the stuff that isn't just right in front of our face, you know, the less intuitive stuff.
Well, but it is right in front of our face, and that's the thing that has not been recognized. We've always looked at things as being different instead of saying, so you've heard of first principles reasoning, right? Like, as many people have by now, because again, it was sort of repopularized, if that's even possible. It's like you listen to Elon Musk and says, "Oh, I just use first principles reasoning," and everybody says, "Oh, Elon Musk came up with this idea." It's like, well, Uncle Aristotle was talking about that long before, you know, we even existed, when he was talking about first principles reasoning. So there are absolute principles upon which we have to behave because they are part of the universe. We are part of the universe, which sounds like this deep and kind of esoteric thought process. But the reality is, like, we just have to follow the rules. Mm-hmm. And so the concept of a gradient exists because that's how movement is produced on all scales. There has to be a change to allow change to occur. If there's no change, then it's static. Nothing happens, right? And so now the question mark becomes, is like, okay, so how do things move in the universe? Well, they get bigger or they get smaller. So that's compression expansion. And so if that's the principle, if that's the rule, then all we have to do is say, well, how do humans do it? And what they did is they used the model that they had to establish a thought process, which is actually useful. And they said, well, let's look at dead guys, because we can't cut the live people open, because that would be bad, right? So they started looking at dead guys and say, oh, look, we pull on these things and we got levers and pulleys. And so dead guys do have levers and pulleys, but humans don't. And that's a tough leap for a lot of people, because they just make this direct association. But all you got to do is look at one dry cadaver, and then you look at a fresh cadaver dissection, and you see two different representations right away, right? So I had the benefit of that a few years ago when I did a series of fresh cadaver dissections. And I actually, some of my students actually got to participate in some of those. So they actually got to see it happening as well. And that was incredibly enlightening as to how we do some of this stuff. And so now we start saying, well, okay, wait a minute, this is a fluid model. All right. So this makes more sense that what we're actually doing is we're changing shape. And it's like, okay, well, how do humans compress and expand? And we could start with something compartmentalized, like a fascial compartment or something like that gives us a little bit of a closer dose of reality. And then we have to start looking deeper and deeper into structure. And so when you look at a collagen fiber, and what is it? It's helically oriented. Okay, great. And then if you look at the larger scale, as you build yourself outward from that simple collagen fiber, you see that everything is organized in these spiral orientations. And it's like, oh, wait a minute, that they're all helices. And then you say, well, where's my best representation for the helix? And you go, oh, holy cow, I got a big giant one staring me at the face, right? And then that's when we started looking at the archetype structures, where I said, well, some people flatter helices and some people are more vertical helices. Well, it stands to reason that your strategies would have to be different because you only have so many options that are available to you, but you have to still follow the general principle of compression and expansion. And so it's like literally that. This is why we talk about fractals. That's why the fractal representations are so important. And you look at everywhere, you see this repeating rule concept, right? If something works, nature repeats it. So that's why does everybody see the Fibonacci spirals everywhere? Well, because it represents an element of efficiency and structure. Right, so it makes sense that it would repeat itself on many different scales and in many different representations because it works, right? And so everything moves towards efficiency. Everything moves towards efficiency. So it's like never stand when you can sit, and never sit when you can lay down, and never just lay down when you can sleep, right? So again, we're always looking for like the most efficient energy output, and so when we talk about physical structures, so the tetrahedron is our second most efficient representation. So a sphere would be this perfect representation of efficiency. It's the least surface area with the greatest volume, right? So that's why everything kind of in the universe kind of falls towards that spherical representation. Why are the planets round? Well, because that's the most efficient representation. Here's the problem. In biology, we don't have curves. We only have straight lines. Okay, so I have to create the next most efficient structure, which is a tetrahedron. So that is the least volume with the greatest surface area, right? And so now I am constructed with these tetrahedrons. Well, but if you slam enough tetrahedrons together, you get the helix. And then the helix is the collagen fiber. And then everything else, you see how it builds out into its larger and larger representations. And then all we have to do is observe and say, well, how does this behave? How does this fit into the rules of the universe in regards to compression expansion? How do I create the gradients? And then everything just kind of slowly falls into place if you just pay attention. So that's how it evolved. It was basically like, it's like, okay, what are the real rules? Because the problem that I ran into is everybody had different rules. Instead of like saying like, what's the commonality? Like, why do you think that? Why does, and a lot of stuff works, but then you would hit the limit. Right. So if you, and the mistake that I made is buying into any singular system. It's like you buy into a system. There is great stuff in some of that stuff when you have nothing else to work with. But then when you invest yourself in it, if you pay attention long enough, you realize that you hit the limit of that because the model upon which it is based is limited in scope. It's not following the principles. They made up their own rules. And so the goal, and you, if you listen to me long enough, I do use the word coherence a lot because it has to be consistent with the absolute laws, right? I cannot defy gravity as hard as I have tried in my lifetime. I cannot defy gravity, right? And so I have to appreciate that. What does that do? Considering my physical structure, considering what I am made of, right? You're 99% water, 1% stuff. Well, how does the water behave? Okay, there's fluid mechanics. How does the stuff behave? Okay, there's structure that has to follow the rules, right? And so again, if anything is in opposition of what I understand as those principles, then it doesn't fit. But everything that does then starts to make sense. And so then now you have gradients, we have fluid pressures, we have compression, we have expansion, we have helical orientations. That creates expansion and compression within and of itself. That creates shape change. So all proteins change shape based on the influences that are applied. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
A bit.
That's how this came to be.
Yeah, because I was like, what thought mindset did you find yourself in when you started to recognize that it could be better? And then when you started to find what was better, those things were actually beautifully coherent with these governing models. And I was just very curious how conscious you were of that. Because when you look at some of these papers that were put out in like 26, where they were really starting to figure out where like wave particle duality was, or how it was working, and they're explaining one guy in particular. I like to read his stuff. He's not as popular, Walter Russell. He's got beautiful explanations of how there's basically one thing in the universe that one thing fluctuates between these two polarized extremes of magnetism, which is basically a centrifugal, concentrating force. You've got electricity, which is this centripetal expanding force. And I'm like, that's Bill's model. I'm like, this is what Bill's talking, or I'm like, Bill's model is describing what these physicists.
No, that's the model. That's the model that we have to follow.
Yeah, well,
like not my like that's not me. That's just me going, oh, okay. So if that's how it works, how do we do that?
You're the only one who's had the presence of mind to say, let's maybe try to do something radical and
but see, it's not radical. It's not radical, Paul. It's just looking at it as the representation and identifying the foundational principles and then following those principles. That's all. That's all it is.
But how many people I mean radical by?
I don't know. Paul, you see this little corner? This is my world. This is literally like I go two places. I go here and then I go to IFAST. It's like, that's it. That's all I do. Right. And I'm happy with that. But again, it's like, it's just following principles. Like yes, my model is a representation. It's a specific application to the universal principles. Yeah. Right. And it's like, you'll see this in, it's sort of like looking for the unified field theory in human behaviors, right? So you mentioned something about consciousness and things like that, and I would argue that there's going to be, like, if I ever get into that aspect of it, it will be coherent with what we talk about in regards to movement. If you read like a nice pop sci book that covers this in my favorite way is Jeff Hawkins on Intelligence, where he's talking about the existence of consciousness, creativity, etc., as a simple representation of the existence of your cortex. Like, it's like consciousness is just simply the existence of a cortex. If you don't have a cortex, then you're not really conscious. But it doesn't mean that you don't use memory. It doesn't mean you don't use prediction. It just means that you're just not conscious.
Yeah, that's what I've grown to learn. But then when you start listening to some of these other folks, they're like, it seems based on some of these experiments where we take people and we put them in Faraday cages, and then we put another person in a different room in a Faraday cage, we can see how there is actually, like, you can entangle consciousness, like almost the same way you can entangle particles, where they block all electromagnetic frequencies from hitting this individual, but they somehow can produce, like, they'll scare somebody who's maybe a loving partner to this individual, or they'll have them like pray or meditate, do something that kind of entangles them, put them in Faraday cages, and they can produce these like non-local consciousness effects where they scare this person, and this person actually has an electrical change in their activity. So they're showing that consciousness may not be produced by the brain. Your brain might just be like this reducing valve for something that is around, that is, it doesn't, just because of some of the elegance of some of these experiments that they're showing, it's like, there's implications. It's not as, like it's not as black and white, like you say it's gray. It's like there may be.
Oh, I think there's definitely gray here, but I would also say that, so if we looked at, and again, I'm going to be kind of quoting Jeff Hawkins, because again, this is my personal bias, right? Mm-hmm. Where the mind is definitely part of the brain, but the brain is definitely separate from the body, because there's representations of that, in regards to people that would suffer from Alzheimer's, for instance. So that's somebody that their mind is no longer capable, yet the body does. And then you can look at other people that lose the ability to use their body, but yet their brain is perfectly healthy as far as they're concerned, like they're perfectly aware, etc. So again, it's like there's a little bit of a separation there in regards to that. But I would argue that what people appreciate as this conscious experience is merely just the behavior capabilities of the brain, as what it is capable of doing. So somebody can look at a sunset and go, wow. And then the other guy looks at the sunset and goes, yes, it's a sunset. Nothing special. It happens every night. right? And so some people try to create a something special and unique about consciousness when it is literally just how that cortex behaves. It creates those representations. Otherwise, we would all feel the same things, and we don't, right? And so it's just taking our perceptions and feeding that information into the brain, and then the brain spits out whatever it is that it spits out. And again, and again, I don't want to get too deep on this because again, it's well above my pay grade. I try to stay in my wheelhouse. But it's nothing special. It is literally the mechanical behaviors that we are capable of, and again, it just produces whatever outcome it produces, and then how we pay attention to that.
Isn't that similar to kind of saying like we can't fly, so like our bodies aren't designed to fly, so that's out of our wheelhouse. Like we primitively, our understanding of the brain has been one thing, and now is the research and all this, we've developed technology that's allowed us to look far enough down at the microscopic scales and see that the way we thought about things, consciousness and the brain in particular, might not be as limited as we thought. It might be, who knows? It might be meaningless. It could just be a cortex. But
I just tend to think that we're not that special, and we're just a byproduct of like pure mechanical opportunity. Right? It's like, as far as we know, there is no other being like us. Like, again, and who knows what's possible, right? But the reality is like, as far as we know, there's nothing like us anywhere. So this is just like random, right? Perfect storm of situations that arose and evolved.
Yeah.
And I just don't think we're special. I don't think consciousness is anything unique. I think it's just a simple byproduct of what we are made of, and then we just follow the guiding principles that exist in the universe that we can't change. That's it. And again, it's like, we're getting way above my pay grade here, right? That's why I like the physical properties a lot, because that's so much easier to grasp than it is trying to talk about something that is kind of in this like nebulous, it seems different. And I don't think it is. I don't think anything is different.
I mean, it technically can't be different since it's part of this model. There's like one model. So it's even if we don't view it as like a special thing that a lot of people try to attribute to existence.
Yeah.
In that sense, we're lucky. Statistically, we're lucky, but maybe just like as far as luck, like being attributed to a human experience, I see what you're saying about it being inherently meaningless. There's no objective authority to be like, this is the meaning behind your existence. Nobody's doing that. But I mean, I guess the special stuff I'm pointing to, like non-local consciousness. Let's just say it is a thing. And let's say we understand how to influence that enough. That when I was writing my question, this is the part I saved for in person, I thought maybe 50 years down the line, some students of yours and the technology that's available at the time will be able to perhaps influence physiology from a distance.
Okay, now hang on. So that statement right there, I think, is very accurate right now. Okay. So and again, we don't have to step outside the realm of our reality. Mm-hmm. All right. You can measure the electromagnetic field of the heart 3 feet away from a human body. Okay. So if I can measure that, mm-hmm. that far away, so literally it's outside of what we would consider the barrier, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Then it stands to reason that I can influence it from a distance under the same, in some other way, right? Whatever it may be. Sure. All right. So I think that we're already kind of there. What we may have misrepresented is where the barrier is. Okay. So you have space around you. We've talked about this a little bit. There is space around you that compresses and expands, right? That electromagnetic field looks just like the electromagnetic field that surrounds the Earth. It's the same shape.
Torus, right?
Right. Yeah, stands to reason. Okay. So again, it's like, so if that has a shape, then I can access that in some way, shape, or form. If anybody stands too close to you, right? You got a close talker, right? Okay. It's uncomfortable. Why? They're not touching you, but they've interfered with the field that surrounds you. And so again, it's like we just have to we have to recognize maybe the barrier that we see, right, where our skin, fits into the space. Maybe our representation is a little bit bigger than what we thought it was. And so I do think that we can influence that.
That's great. I like that. I like that.
So and again, I think that is something that is again, there's research on this. And so you'll see, okay, here's a really, really interesting representation of this. And this is based on people that suffer from anorexia, is that their perception of their physical size relative to that peripersonal space is different from someone that does not experience the same thing. So their representation is that they're filling this space to a greater degree than someone else. And so again, their strategy then becomes, well, I need to make myself smaller. So how do you make yourself smaller? Well, you don't eat, right? And so again, so that's one of those things that is perceptual, which is, and again, well above my pay grade, not my area of specialty at all. It's just something that I have been exposed to, and therefore recognize this influence of how big this space is. So as the space gets bigger, right, maybe that's where my position of comfort becomes. If the space gets too small, then I get uncomfortable, and now I have to have a behavior that is associated with that. So how do you do that? Well, I try to make myself smaller because my space got smaller. Well, what do we call that? In my model, we call that compressive strategies, right? I make myself smaller because the space is moving in around me. So I am going to compress. So how do we get people to expand the space around them where I can move into that space? Well, I expand myself from the inside out. So that's my ERs. That's my expansion representation of the eccentric orientation of musculature. And now I can access those spaces around me that disappear when I compress myself. So there's a behavioral element that goes into that. So people that like to talk about autonomic nervous system, it's like, okay, when you're sympathetically driven, guess what? That space is compressing into you. It's preventing you from accessing areas. That's very stressful. I got the elephant sitting on my chest, and it's like, get the elephant off your chest, and now you can access that space.
So this field, what did you call it? Peripersonal field?
Peripersonal space is what it's how it would be referred to. Peripersonal, anything that's like it surrounds you, and it does have a shape. So they actually have identified the shape of this thing. Right. And it's based on your perceptions. So whatever senses that you have available to you that you would use, there would be sort of like this bias of the shape around you. And again, it compresses and expands, just like we were talking about in the anorexic representation, where they see themselves as filling this space and they don't have enough space around them for comfort. And so the way that they create comfort is by making themselves smaller relative to what they perceive as their peripersonal space.
And so within that peripersonal space, you'd also have measurable things like you were describing, the electromagnetic forces of the heart. I'm sure alpha, delta, gamma, all these different waves coming out of the brain. I'm sure
every organ has its own electromagnetic field. All organs produce an electromagnetic field.
Okay.
And then there's the representation of this of the everything combined, right? And you've probably seen like that's like it's not the, I can't remember the name of the shape now. It'll come to me in a minute. It's kind of like a big donut.
Oh yeah. Okay. So this peripersonal space, we've got forces coming from the body in this space, and it seems that those forces and the space itself house those forces is influenced by consciousness to some extent, right? Like how you perceive, like perception.
So perception would probably be a better representation than consciousness as some sort of vague representation. The only way that the brain has any idea what's going on in the world is through your perceptions, because, again, I'm quoting Jeff Hawkins here, your brain lives in a dark box, right? It does not have, so the brain doesn't have a representation of itself. It only has a representation of the world based on the perceptions that you take in. Very important to understand. The brain doesn't know anything about itself because it can't feel. The brain has no sensation.
That's like a Klein bottle of a thought process to try to figure out. Like the brain trying to picture itself based on.
But it doesn't, because again, so to create a representation of anything, there has to be some perceptual element. If the brain doesn't have sensation and it only draws on the body's sensation, the body is part of the world, and then the existence expands outward from there.
Mm-hmm. So that field around us that is sort of beyond our physical boundary.
Yep.
I guess I'm wondering if eventually, and this isn't a question, it's just like part of my thinking as we consider the implications of this stuff. Eventually, if, I've heard of terms like telesomatic, treatment and stuff like that, where you've got people who now just like got hypnotists and Reiki healers, energy workers type people like that, who are really not being, they're not being studied in the labs yet or anything like that. But eventually, if we'd have that kind of ability, you'd still have to use movement to, change behavior of tissues and stuff like that. So that's obviously going to still be its own thing. But when we talk about the body, it's hard to not talk about the mind, So that's where these questions of consciousness come in when I start looking at your model and also seeing how your model's working really well with quantum physics today, and that has a weird tie to consciousness. So I'm like, A plus B equals,
Yeah, I mean, I see where you're going. I mentioned this before. It's like my thinking's about as shallow as a puddle under most circumstances, because again, I don't want to seem too out there.
Sure.
Without sufficient support for it. And the things that I talk about the most are the things that consistently are represented in the way that I work.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm gonna probably assume that role of the dreamer, the imaginer, so that way I don't know. There's got to be some stuff we haven't figured out yet. I always get this feeling like we're so advanced, we've got so much figured out, but then every couple of years something happens. They're like, Pentagon's like, we have vehicles not made on this Earth, by the way, in case you were wondering, and like all these new things coming about that challenge the way we thought we were secure with our thinking. So I appreciate you taking the time to just.
Well, it all really good, difficult questions, right? And I really love the concept of looking at this from a coherent standpoint. Mm-hmm. It stands to reason that there are fewer and fewer rules than we think. Everything falls off of simple things. And what's his name? Conway's Game of Life. You ever seen that? Mm-hmm. Google it, Conway's Game of Life. It's a cool little representation that shows how complexity arises from the simplest of rules. And I think there's like 3 or 4 rules that the game follows, but it creates these beautiful representations of things that can move through space or change shape, right? Based on rules. So it has like it's a good representation of how things evolve or things die off naturally, or how things arise. And so it's just a fun little game to play. Awesome. But the point behind the game is not to play the game. It's to see literally how you don't need, 25 different rules to create something that's very, very complex. You need something as simple as maybe 2 things, and then just let it go and see what happens, kind of a thing. So.
That's when you hear these particle physicists describe it, they say similar things. They're like, it's not the rules that are complicated. The rules are very basic. It's the interconnectedness and exactness of the, or I guess the, what did Feynman say? It was the, just how many things are being coordinated at once and with such precision. That's what we don't really understand. It's these basic rules governing all this, but
right. So we see the representation of the complexity that is the result of time and these rules being repeated from different initial conditions. So you ever cut a Mobius loop long ways?
No, I don't know what that is.
You don't know what a Mobius loop is? You mentioned a Klein bottle, but you don't know what a Mobius loop is?
Nope.
Okay, a Mobius loop. So a Klein bottle is a 3-dimensional Mobius loop.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So a Mobius loop is a loop that has one side, not two sides. So a normal loop has an inside and an outside. A Mobius loop is continuous. So if you take a pencil and you draw a line on the Mobius loop, you end up in the same place where you started, okay? However, the really cool thing is, it's like I can take two Mobius loops that are exactly the same. In fact, I did this with a student on Wednesday. And if you cut the Mobius loop down the middle, like the dead center middle, what happens is it creates a bigger, longer Mobius loop. If you cut it off to one side, where you're cutting it in like a 2/3, 1/3 representation, you actually get two interjoining loops. So literally with the same starting conditions, but a different stimulus, you get two different representations, right? And so when we're talking about complexity, we see all of these things that are just amazing changes over time. And we say, well, there must have been so many different things. It's like, no, it's like, because every time you get a new representation, the starting conditions for the same rules that are applied are they're applied to a different representation. So I'm going to get a different outcome. That's why we see these deviations in evolution of, well, they have a common ancestor, but this one was stimulated this way. This one was stimulated this way. So then we have the divergence.
Okay.
Pretty cool.
That's awesome. I appreciate it.
It is. It's just fun. This is just fun stuff, right?
And it's good to chat this stuff out instead of keeping it all.
It is. Well, well, you can share your misery.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
There's my landscapers. So.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, boss. I got to run for it. Sorry.
I'll see you Thursday.
Very good to talk to you. I'll see you on Thursday. All right.